It was April 19th, 1942. The day after 16 B-25 bombers struck the heart of Japan, American airmen began trickling into the Chinese city of Chuzhou. Chinese villagers paraded the raiders through ancient walled cities, waving banners and offering food. Some raiders gave away personal items as tokens of gratitude. The celebrations felt surreal. 56 airmen had survived the mission, but not all were safe. Jimmy Doolittle arrived in Chuzhou on April 26th, exhausted from days in the wilderness. He soon received word that his superiors had sent congratulations and that his nomination for brigadier general had gone to the Senate. By May 3rd, over 20 raiders traveled west to Chungking, China's wartime capital. There they received the Distinguished Flying Cross and dined with Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Madame Chiang. She is the most impressive character I have ever had the privilege to meet, one pilot wrote in his diary. The airmen feasted on onion soup, cold ham, and ice cream. It was their best meal in China, but while some raiders celebrated, others suffered. The crew of the Green Hornet had crashed into the sea off China. Chase Nielsen, Dean Hallmark, and Bob Metter were captured by Japanese forces. On April 25th, guards transported them to Tokyo and delivered them to the headquarters of the gendarmerie. The interrogators were ruthless. They removed Nielsen's blindfold and revealed a bare room with only a table and 3 chairs. A Japanese civilian named O'Hara, a Columbia graduate, tried to charm him with talk of baseball. Then the real questioning began. Guards slapped and kicked the American aviator, whose legs were tied and hands bound behind his chair. The abuse reopened wounds on Nielsen's shins. Blood ran down his legs. After hours of interrogation, guards hauled him to a cell barely 4 feet wide and 8 feet deep. A latrine bucket sat in the corner. He collapsed on a grass mat and slept until 7 in the morning. Breakfast was watery rice and a cup of miso soup. The interrogation resumed immediately. We didn't get the brutal treatment we'd received right after we were captured, Nielsen later wrote. A more subtle form of torture began at Tokyo. The endless days and nights of solitary confinement in stinking, filthy cells with just enough food to keep us alive. The other captured raiders, including Billy Farrow and Harold Spatz, endured the same treatment. The Japanese wanted to know where the bombers had come from. The airmen gave only their name, rank, and serial number, 200 miles south of Tokyo. Another raider fought for his life. Ted Lawson, pilot of the ruptured duck, had crashed into the surf off the Chinese coast. Gangrene had set into his left leg. Dr. Thomas White knew he had to act. On May 4th, inside a primitive hospital at Linhai, White prepared to amputate. The pilot sensed the doctor's unease. "Yeah, I think so," White said when Lawson asked if he planned to take his leg. "Doc didn't ask me how I felt about it," Lawson later recalled. "All I could think of now was getting rid of that damned thing." White injected spinal Novocaine smuggled from Shanghai. The surgical team used instruments from the 1890s. Lawson remained awake throughout. He watched White saw through the bone above his knee. "It made a strange, faraway, soggy sound," he wrote. 2 Chinese nurses carried the leg out the door. White closed the wound layer by layer with raw silk suture ties. The surgery saved Lawson's life, but his recovery was slow. Infection persisted. White gave him blood transfusions, using his own type O blood when supplies ran low. Japanese bombers droned overhead daily, striking nearby towns. The enemy was advancing. On May 17th, the airmen knew they had run out of time. "Have to leave tomorrow, rain or shine," White wrote in his diary. The raiders climbed into sedan chairs and set off through cold rain. Lawson's porter carried him around the hospital and paused beside a wooden coffin. "It was a new one, made by the same Chinese carpenter who had made my crutches," Lawson wrote. "It was to have been mine." The column crossed a pontoon bridge and headed up the valley, leaving Linhai behind as Japanese forces closed in. Doolittle landed in Washington on May 18th after a 2-week journey across India, North Africa, and South America. A staff car whisked him to the War Department, where General Arnold and General Marshall waited. Arnold instructed him to buy new clothes and stay out of sight until called. The next morning, Arnold and Marshall picked him up in a staff car and told him they were going to the White House. President Roosevelt was going to give him the Medal of Honor. Doolittle protested the award, arguing every man on the mission took the same risk. Marshall shot back that he thought Doolittle deserved it. At the White House, Roosevelt greeted him warmly and pinned the five-pointed star above his left pocket. News photographers captured the moment as Joe Doolittle watched. The War Department released a statement giving the country the first real details of the mission. Doolittle then wrote personal letters to the families of all 79 raiders. For the parents of Leland Factor, who died bailing out, he expressed deep regret. To Billy Farrow's mother, he reported that 2 crew members were missing and 3 captured, information that was not yet public. He signed off with the same warmth he had shown to every family, but the letters to the captured airmen's mothers were the hardest to write. Many would continue writing to Doolittle for months, desperate for any news of their sons. On May 24th, American diplomats finally reached the interned crew of Ski York near Penza, Russia. Colonel Joseph Michela and Edward Page, the second secretary of the embassy, arrived at the dacha where the raiders had been held since their landing in Vladivostok. The airmen had endured a 21-day train ride across Siberia, their hopes of a quick release fading each day. When the diplomats confirmed that getting out of Russia was not easy, the men's spirits sank visibly. The diplomats promised to stay in touch weekly and hoped to have the crew out in 2 to 3 weeks. They brought supplies, cigarettes, soap, and magazines. York asked about the fate of the other raiders, but Michela could offer no concrete details. Page translated a telegram for Pilot Emmons. He had a new son back home. The small news lifted the room, but the uncertainty of their own situation remained unresolved. Ambassador Stanley reported that the Russians had treated the intern crew well, good food, athletic facilities, and freedom of movement. But May gave way to June, then July, and the promised release never came. The crew was never allowed outside the dacha. Supplies ran low. Cigarettes disappeared, then meat, then vegetables. Even vodka grew scarce. They began rolling their own cigarettes using Pravda and Russian tobacco, wondering when their own people would get them out. On June 3rd, a DC-3 landed at Kweilin with Army Air Forces markings, finally evacuating the wounded raiders from the Chinese interior. After a multi-leg journey, Lawson arrived in Washington on June 16th. An ambulance from Walter Reed Hospital met them on the tarmac. Lawson was placed in Ward 5, sharing a room with Harold Watson, who was recovering from a broken arm. Doolittle arrived that evening. Lawson tried to stand, but Doolittle put his hands on his shoulders and would not let him. The general apologized for not being at Bowling Field to greet them. He asked about Lawson's family situation. Lawson stalled, wanting a good night's sleep before deciding how to tell his wife about his leg. Doolittle pressed on. "Do you know about your mother? She's had a stroke." Lawson fell silent. Doolittle called Lawson's wife in Los Angeles. She was 8 months pregnant. When she arrived at the hospital days later, Lawson tried to walk toward her on crutches and fell on his face. He would endure a second amputation on his left leg, followed by oral surgery to reshape his mouth and remove broken teeth. The doctors found beach sand still embedded in the wound from the crash. Doolittle visited regularly, bringing news from the front. On June 27th, 23 raiders gathered at Bowling Field for a public ceremony. General Arnold stood behind the podium as Colonel Leslie Holcomb read the citation. Arnold walked down the line and pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross above the left shirt pocket of each airman. The medals had arrived packed in 3 green wooden boxes. A half-dozen wives watched from the side. Bill Pound's spouse arrived late, tears streaming down her face after getting lost in an air raid traffic test. The military had designed the ceremony to shine a light on the young heroes, but strict limits remained on what could be released. No information about the starting point of the raid, the ultimate destination of the bombers, or the loss of planes could be made public. The nation still believed all 16 bombers had made it safely back. The families of the 8 captured raiders had already been privately informed by Doolittle himself, but the American public still did not know their sons were in Japanese hands. The secret of Shangri-La had to be preserved. Back in Shanghai, the captured raiders from the Green Hornet and the Bat out of Hell had been transferred to Bridge House Prison in late June. Guards forced them into cell number 6, already packed with 15 other prisoners. The stench was overwhelming. Chase Nielsen tried to sleep sitting up, leaning against another prisoner. Dysentery hit Dean Hallmark hard. He could not control his bowels. The airmen took turns holding his head in their laps, singing songs he remembered from home. They scratched a message into the wall, their names, their plane, the word crashed. They did not know if anyone would ever read it. Early June 1942, Japanese forces surged south from their base at Nanchang, driving deep into the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. The priests at the Linchuan mission had helped raiders after the Tokyo strike. Now the enemy came for revenge. Gwendolyn Dunker, a Catholic missionary, watched as soldiers stormed the compound at Yihuang. He escaped through a back gate, grabbing only a briefcase of cash. Machine gun fire rattled behind him as he fled into the hills with a handful of orphans. For weeks, the Japanese swept through town after town. They burned homes, looted shops, and shot anyone who moved. In the city of Nanchang, soldiers rounded up 800 women and held them in a warehouse, assaulting them day after day. When the occupation ended, special incendiary squads moved in. They poured kerosene over every building and set the city ablaze. Nanchang became charred earth. Dunker returned to Yihuang after the enemy moved through. The stench of death hit him first. Dogs had dug up corpses left to rot in the streets. Flies swarmed so thick he had to keep his mouth shut. The mission was wrecked, though not burned like the rest of the town. Soldiers had smashed his typewriter and stolen his razor. He salvaged 2 bottles of beer from the basement. Every town the Japanese entered, he later wrote, became another Nanking on a small scale. Gwendolyn Dunker survived the war and later wrote extensively about the atrocities he witnessed in Zhejiang mid-July. The Japanese unleashed a weapon far worse than fire. Major General Shiro Ishii led Unit 731, a clandestine outfit operating from a secret compound in Manchuria. His researchers bred fleas in 4,500 incubators, churning out 145 million every few months. They filled the parasites with plague bacteria. They also mass-produced anthrax, cholera, and typhoid germs. The target was the civilian population of Zhejiang. Ishii dispatched 120 officers and technicians to Nanking. They packed bacteria into metal flasks labeled as drinking water. Soldiers tossed the containers into wells and marshes. Troops also handed out 3,000 rolls contaminated with typhoid to Chinese prisoners of war, then released them to spread disease. 400 infected biscuits were left near fences and roads, knowing hungry villagers would find and eat them. The results were devastating. Cholera broke out across the region. Entire villages fell sick with dysentery and plague. Chinese journalist Yang Kang traveled through the area in late July and found every house stricken. One woman who answered her door was pale and clearly ill. "Everybody is sick," she told Kang. Even Japanese soldiers fell victim. A captured lance corporal later reported that up to 10,000 troops were infected, mostly with cholera. He said 1,700 had died, though the actual number was likely far higher. The floors were hard wood. Sitting for hours caused boils to erupt on their hips. Beriberi set in from malnutrition. Height could press his leg and leave a dimple in the muscle. One airman went 17 days without a bowel movement. The only relief came from talking. They talked about football and baseball and the things they had done in their lives. Mostly they talked about food. They planned every meal they would order if they ever got out. Thick steaks, pie, ice cream. They talked about God, too. "A fellow thinks a lot about God," Nielsen later said. At a time like that, August 28th, guards came for the 8 raiders and loaded them onto trucks. Hallmark was too weak to walk. Billy Farrow and Bob Height carried him out on a stretcher. The Japanese transported them to Qiangwan Military Prison on the outskirts of Shanghai. At 2:30 in the afternoon, guards marched the handcuffed airmen into a courtroom. Lieutenant Colonel Toyoma Nakayo sat on a dais behind a desk, flanked by 2 associate judges. When Nielsen asked the interpreter what the punishment was, the answer came back cold. "The judge has ordered that you not be told of your sentence." Guards ushered the 7 healthier men into individual cells. Hallmark was sent back alone to Bridge House, still on his stretcher. He lay on the filthy floor, depended on fellow prisoners to lift him onto the latrine. His bowels would just move themselves. He weighed only as much as his bones. On October 14th, workers at a Japanese carpentry shop built 3 wooden crosses and 3 coffins. That same night, Guards brought Dean Hallmark from Bridge House Prison to Kiangwon, where Billy Farrow and Harold Spatz already waited in separate cells. The warden, Sotojiro Tatsuda, handed each airman blank paper and ordered them to write final letters to their families. Hallmark, still weak from dysentery, wrote to his parents in Dallas that he could hardly believe what was about to happen. Farrow, the South Carolinian, who had always protected his family, urged his mother to keep her chin up and trust in God. Spatz wrote just 6 sentences to his father in Kansas, saying he died fighting for his country like a soldier. None of those letters were ever mailed. The next morning, guards drove the 3 airmen to Public Cemetery No. 1 overlooking a golf course in the Shanghai racetrack. Workers had already planted the 3 fresh wood crosses in front of a ruined Chinese temple. The prosecutor informed the raiders that the order of execution had arrived and told them to die like brave soldiers. Guards bound each man to a cross with white cloths, then placed a blindfold over their eyes with a black dot drawn above the nose. A firing squad of 6 riflemen took aim from 20 meters away. At the command, 3 shots rang out. All 3 airmen slumped forward, killed instantly by expert marksmen. Medical officers certified the deaths and bandaged the wounds before soldiers laid the bodies in the coffins. The Japanese cremated Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz that same day at the Residents Association crematorium. The warden kept Hallmark's leather flying jacket, ordering an interpreter to have the name cut out and the coat resized for his own use. Back at Kiangwon Military Prison, the 5 other raiders remained in their cells, unaware of what had transpired. Bob Metter would later die in captivity in December 1943. The remaining 4 would spend the rest of the war in solitary confinement, wondering when their own sentences might be carried out. On October 22, 1942, the United States War Department confirmed that the Japanese had executed some of the captured Doolittle Raiders. The same day, Tokyo radio broadcast fabricated accounts claiming the airmen had machine-gunned schoolchildren and bombed hospitals. The false confessions extracted through torture painted the raiders as bloodthirsty criminals rather than soldiers. Across America, newspapers ran headlines screaming for vengeance. The long-held secrecy about the raid's losses now gave way to raw fury. 6 months later, on April 21, 1943, the Japanese released a detailed propaganda version of the raid, mocking Doolittle as a coward and calling the mission a flop. President Roosevelt responded with a statement of deepest horror, vowing that the barbarous executions would only harden American resolve. From his new post in North Africa, Doolittle himself addressed reporters. "We will bomb Japan until the empire crumbles," he said. "We will drop each bomb in memory of our murdered comrades." The words carried the weight of a nation's grief and determination. The 4 surviving captured raiders, Chase Nielsen, Robert Hite, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer, endured the rest of the war in solitary confinement at Kiangwon Military Prison, never knowing when their own sentences might be carried out. Bob Metter died in prison in December 1943. Ted Lawson recovered at home in the United States, his amputated leg a permanent reminder of the raid's cost. Ski York and his crew remained interned in Russia until long after the war's end. Jacob DeShazer later returned to Japan as a Christian missionary, offering forgiveness to his former captors. The final letters written by Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were never mailed, sealed in Japanese files as silent testaments to men who faced death with courage. The Doolittle Raid, for all its modest military damage, had achieved something deeper. It proved that Japan was not invulnerable and that America would fight back. If you have family stories or personal recollections from the early days of the Pacific War, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our work, bringing these histories to life. Thank you for listening.